Okay, we are live, and thank you guys for joining. Thanks, Arno and Josephus, for being here. We're just setting up right now, putting a few documents together so we can discuss the Ashvins, the horse twin deities. And so, you guys feel like you have those Greek hymns together as much as possible. Other than that, I was just trying to find the best Vedic material. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Josephus, for the moment, but I also have McDonald's. McDonald has a section on the Ashvins that has some good references, so I'm gonna refer back to that unless you have any thoughts.
I mean, I'm browsing the Rig Veda as well, so let's see what comes up.
Okay, perfect. I think I'll just begin with this passage that I have highlighted from McDonald here, and not up on the screen, but this is just the Vedic Ashvins, and so of course the Ashvins are the horse twins, and Ashva means horse essentially, and so that is what their name directly means. They are the horse riders, horse keepers, that sort of thing. And a few key points are that they are the children of heaven, that is to say, Dyaush, that is found in Rig Veda 1.82 and 1.84. And other times, let's see, Hushan claims them as his fathers. That's interesting. Their sister in Rig Veda 1.180 is Dawn or Ushas. And it's often associated with the sun, especially, let's see, the daughter of the sun, Surya. They are Surya's two husbands in Rigveda 4.43, whom she chose in Rigveda 7.69. And Surya, or the maiden, ascended in their car. The daughter of the sun mounts their car in Rigveda 1.34 and 116 and 118. Okay. Or chose it in 1.117. They possess Surya as their own, and the fact that Surya accompanies them on their car is characteristic. Okay, so that's just to really drive home that we have this figure, this goddess Surya, who is the feminine sun in some way, but she's specifically in the Vedic mythology, she's the daughter of the sun Surya, just a female version of that same name, but she is the daughter, so she's in some way like an expression, a goddess of the sun's light, and she is the bride of the gods in a sense because multiple gods become husband of Surya or of some aspect of Surya in some way, as we saw in the stream on Soma, right? Soma also weds Surya. But it is also a key part of the Ashvin's myth. So the Ashvins are invoked to yeah, this is in their connection to Surya. The Ashvins are invoked to conduct the bride home on their chariot. That is in the Surya's bridal hymn 10.85. They are also besought along with several other deities to bestow fertility on the bride in 10.184. They give the wife of the eunuch a child and make the barren cow yield milk. They give a husband to the old maid in 10.39 and bestowed a wife on one of their favorites, etc. In the Atharva Veda, they are said to bring lovers together. That's Atharva Veda 2.30. So that's very interesting. They are directly said to bring lovers together. I think that that sort of theme there will echo into some of the associations in other branches, especially like Angus Og. So the Ashvins may originally have been conceived as finding and restoring or rescuing the vanished light of the sun. In the Rig Veda, they have come to be typically succoring divinities, so helping, aiding divinities. They are the speediest helpers and deliverers from distress in general in Rig Veda 1.112 and 118. They are constantly praised for such deeds. In particular, they rescue from the ocean in a ship or ships. They are also invoked to bring treasures from the ocean or from heaven in Rig Veda 1.47. And their car approaches from the ocean, 4.43. That's quite interesting. Their car, that's like their chariot, so to speak, their carriage or chariot, approaches from the ocean. So it's some kind of aquatic, or it is a chariot that can go on the waters, apparently, or over the waters, so to speak. And this, it says here, however, the celestial ocean appears to be intended. Okay, so those images, those domains can be kind of overlapped or confused, conflated as well in the poetic imagery. Their rescue from all kinds of distress is a peaceful manifestation of divine grace, not a deliverance from foes in battle. That's interesting. They are also divine physicians in 8.18 who heal disease with the remedies and restore sight. And they are the physicians of the gods and guardians of immortality who ward off death from the worshipper in Atharva Veda 7.53 and Taittiriya Brahmana 3.1.2. Verse 11, and then it says, apart from their character as helpers, healers, and wonder workers, their general beneficence is often praised. They bring their worshiper to old age with seeing eye and reward him with riches and abundance of children. Okay, so I think that is a really good summary, because if we go to specific Rig Veda hymns, this is what I was struggling with. Their mythos, their actual narrative myths, are extremely fragmented in the Rig Veda. And so you'll have a little part of a line mention of them rescuing someone. Sometimes it's a name that only appears in that one Rig Veda passage, so it's very obscure who they're rescuing. Sometimes it ties into other myths, like their interaction with Dadhichi or Dadhyank is found in a fragmented sort of mention in the Rig Veda, so that ties into other stories we can refer back to. So they interact with Dadhichi, they interact with Chavana in the story of Chavana and Sukanya that we went through before. They have these key myths that we can go into, and we have done so, but essentially they are connected to Surya, the bride of the gods. They are connected to being divine helpers, divine rescuers at sea. They're somehow riding over the sea and connected to the light of the sun. Here, I'll bring up one other aspect here, which is, I'm going to remove this. One other reference I'd like to get in front of us before we get going here, which is from my book. And this is sort of, it's just a good little pinpoint, a good reference to how some scholars have discussed them. So yes, this is in the context of their interaction with Chavana. While the power of Soma Chavana seems to be to give immortality itself, it appears to be the function of the Ashvins within this network of gods to play the instrumental role of giving renewed youth, because in the story of Chavana, they are the ones who arrive with the herb, the plant that gives renewed youth, and they come, and Chavana is aged. They use this plant, this special herb, in the waters. They make a magical whatever bath for Chavana, and he goes into it, and these herbs renew his youth. Okay, so that is very much shown to be their role. So that the gods do not merely live forever in an aged and decrepit state. So I think that makes sense. This role relates astrologically. So this is sort of a speculation, a deduction from seeing that role. This role relates astrologically to their possible identification as the morning and evening star, or with the sky at that time. And so this is one of the big mysteries, even in Vedic scholarship, is whether or not the Ashvins were believed to be the stars, the morning star slash evening star itself, or just gods of that time period, that transitional time. Because as you'll see if you read the Vedic scholars, they comment that the sages in the Rig Veda don't even seem to be entirely sure, or at least they're not expressing it clearly, whether the Ashvins are the star itself, or just gods of the light at that time, or something like that. But they are associated with that sort of time transition. Okay, regardless, so we can then kind of question in other parallels and stuff whether the morning and evening star is meant for these other gods or not. That's sort of an open question. So as the hymn says, going before the morning, apportioning the soma, and as the myth shows, mystically healing the gods of wounds and agedness. So discussing theories of the Ashvin's identities, Brereton and Jameson, the translators of the Rig Veda, say, of these theories, perhaps the most influential and enduring has been that the gods represent the morning and evening stars. See, for example, Goto 2009, and that is from their book Rig Veda, A Guide. So both they and Arthur A. MacDonald in Vedic mythology find the evidence inconclusive. Chavana itself, the name of Chavana is the incarnated Soma, at least in this story he seems to be. Chavana itself means the slipping one or the moving, falling one, connected to his slipping from his mother's womb early. Okay, sorry, that is a little bit of a tangent, but that could connect to the appearance of the moon at that time. That is speculation. And if we suppose then, okay, this is going into Mither. What I wanted to really point to here is the footnote, which goes into a bit more about the horse twins generally. So as Donald Ward details, supported by Manhard and Biezais, the divine twins are directly identified as the morning and evening star in Baltic tradition. So see divine twins Donald Ward and etc., as we can see here. Cheryl Steets says, based on comparative analysis, that the horse twins, quote, apparently represent the morning and evening star. The latter identification, although contested in the case of the Vedic Ashvins, is well supported in the remainder of the Indo-European divine twin material, unquote, from her The Sun Maiden's Wedding, page 175. Steets continues, quote, the Soles Meta, the Baltic daughters of the sun, daughter of the sun, is promised in marriage to the sons of heaven. That is the Dievas Deli, the divine twins in the Baltic material. They are called the sons of heaven. So, but given to the moon, paralleling one Vedic version of Surya's betrothal to her suitors, the Ashvins, but subsequent marriage to Soma, who has a lunar identity. In the Latvian Dainas, as in the Rig Veda, the identity of the Sun Maiden's husband changes in certain verses. Another Daina portrays her as marrying the twins with the moon as a kind of best man. In a third Daina, the moon abducts the bride from the twins and takes her from the Daugava to Germany, unquote. And that's from Steets 16 to 17. So this last one directly, speculatively, could parallel the tale of Mither abducting Angus's beloved Englec in the Dinshenhas. So the point there is, it's very fascinating that there is this kind of variability about who the husband of Surya, the solar bride, is, even in the Rig Veda and in the stories that are kind of derived from the Rig Veda. But even in Rig Veda 10.85, Surya's bridal, multiple husbands are kind of circling around the event. It is the marriage of Soma to Surya, but it's at the wedding, the Ashvins are there as kind of wooers or bridegrooms or something like this, or what was the word they used? Rather, I don't know, best men, or they're there in the train of the wedding, sort of helping, facilitating. Um, but at the same time, there is kind of this ambiguity because they are also known to be spouses of Surya. They are there as wooers of Surya. So a wooer can mean like a go-between wooer, wooing on behalf of someone else, but it can also have this ambiguity where they are also potential husbands. You then have Pushan mentioned in Rigveda 10.85 as another husband, and then it goes into a sequence where it says that Surya was given to Agni and then the Gandharva in this sequence, and then and that the Gandharva is then told to seek another from her father's house, as if like another sun princess. So it's this um, very confusing multiplicity of different husbands or potential husbands for the sun princess Surya. We then have in the Baltic material what seems to be variations of who her husband is in different stories, right? Of who the husband of the Solis Meta, the daughter of the sun. It is said that in the Dainas, these poems and these mythical poems, the moon abducts the bride, or the husband changes in certain verses. So that is very fascinating because it's very similar to what we find in the Vedic material. We then find, of course, as I go into in my book, it seems to me like that kind of complicated picture found in the Rig Veda of who the husband is gets kind of spun out into two or three, four different stories that are kind of separate from each other about each one of those husbands. And in each of those cases, the daughter of the sun is appearing under a different name, like as a different sort of epithet or incarnation of that goddess. So we have Sukanya marrying Chavana in that story, and Sukanya is then like a byname or incarnation of Surya, the sun princess, and she marries Chavana. And in that story, of course, the Ashvins are there as rivals to Chavana at first, but then ultimately they end up helping Chavana and helping him renew their youth and all of that. But it has the same kind of tension. And then in other places, of course, in the Rig Veda, it is mentioned that the Ashvins marry Surya, as I read through in the MacDonald passage, or Savitri is another name that comes up that appears to be like an incarnation or byname of Surya, because Savitri is like the female version of Savitar. So it is these solar princess sort of names attaching to these same kind of gods in a somewhat consistent way. So that then becomes, you can see it in the Baltic and in the Vedic material, that we have this kind of fascinating picture of these multiple husbands. That seemed to be something that potentially carries over into the other branches too, where we can start to see that happening potentially in the Norse material, the Celtic material, the Greek material, etc. So with that, as painting this complicated picture, what would you guys like to kind of respond to or build on from there? Any kind of reflections on that?
Well, I would start maybe with the astronomical slash astrological identification between the horse twins and the morning and evening stars. I have actually a passage of the Rig Veda which is pretty explicit in my opinion, so I will just take it.
Excellent.
It's from the eighth book, well, the eighth mandala of the Rig Veda, And it says in Griffith's translation, whether ye lords of ample wealth, and the Sanskrit confirms that actually it's referring to the Ashvin now linger in the east or west, with Druktu or with Anu, Yadu, Turvaga, I call you hither, come to me. Now the interesting part is whether you linger in the east or the west. The Sanskrit terms here are apak, meaning west, so literally going away, and prak, so going forward, which is obviously the east. So the idea is that they appear in the east and the west, presumably in around the sun, right? Like just as the morning or evening star, which is the planet Venus, usually appears either shortly before dawn or shortly after dusk, and that's the only possibility to observe that kind of star. And the whole context of the hymn places them somehow closely to the sun. So, for instance, in the previous line, we see on whom the solemn rise depend, whose worshippers rise without the sun. So without the sun implying perhaps that they're worshipping the rising of the morning star of the planet Venus seen in the morning before the sun, unlike maybe the evening star in this specific instance. But obviously there was some understanding that it was the same planet. And then in the following line, well, no, they are just asked to, well, but they're said to fly or speed through the firmament and through heaven and earth. So there's still something that could be associated with the astronomical motion of the planets, and especially of the planet Venus. Venus and Mercury are among the faster planets. Of course, the moon is even faster, but the moon is clearly identified, obviously, with Chandra and Soma in Vedic material. So planets such as Venus and Mercury, which are very fast and usually appear only in close proximity of the Sun, are obviously great candidates for any astronomical identification, as these passages might suggest, right? Well, obviously, also keeping in mind that we have evidence on the Baltic side that there's an identification between the horsemen twins and the planet Venus. Obviously, the Vedic hymns also kind of seem to play into the same topic, the same identification, even if some scholars are more cautious about this identification. But I think that the text is pretty clear. They go swiftly in the heavens, they either appear in the east before the sun rises or the west. I mean, that's pretty clear
Right.
from this passage to me.
Right. Right. And yeah, it's like one of those things where you could theorize, just to play devil's advocate, you could theorize that the Proto-Indo-European concept was a more like they're associated with the time of the transition around the morning and evening stars. And then that kind of became solidified and concreted into they're definitely the morning and evening stars in the Baltic material. And in the Vedic material, it was kind of vaguely both or neither. That could be one way you could interpret what's going on, is that it was more open-ended, and then there was a tendency toward solidifying that in one way or the other, but it wasn't necessarily the original concept. That's, to play devil's advocate, but at the same time, that is it's still a very strong link. And if you have it identified as the morning and evening stars in the Baltic material, and then you have it half identified that way in the Vedic material suggested, it is pretty strong. So that brings me to wonder about the Greek material in that context, because are the Dioscuri, so the Dioscuri are, of course, the Dios, that's referring to Zeus, so they are Zeus's boys. Kuroi means boys, so that is their name is equivalent to the Baltic name. Very clearly, the Baltic name was the sons of the Dievas, Dievas, Delhi, the sons of Dievas, and then we have um, Zeus's boys, Dioscoroi. And so are the Dioscoroi, the Dioscuri associated or identified directly with the morning and evening star? And then this, of course, brings up the question of like phosphorus and Eosphorus or Hesperus, whatever the second name is.
Yeah, Eosporus is another name for Posporos. They're just variants of
Phosphorus.
this.
Okay.
Well, they have
Okay.
a
Right.
different
Right.
prefix, right? Pos means light, and Eos means dawn, like the dawn, the beginning of the day. So of
Okay.
course, they imply in both cases the morning star, and then Hesperos is the evening star. But it's
Right. Okay.
eventually understood to be the same planet that
Okay.
happens to appear both at evening and night.
Okay. That makes sense. That's why those were in my head. But so if you could if you have any information or thoughts on that, do you know if the Dioscuri or were ever identified with the morning and evening star, or do you think they are equatable to the Eosphorus and Hesperus? Sorry, and can you conflate those, equate those two pairs? Are they distinct? What are your thoughts on how that picture works?
So actually, surprisingly, as opposed to the Vedic material, I don't see any explicit identification between the Dioscuroi and the planet Venus in the Homeric hymns. It seems pretty clear that to the ancient Greeks and Romans, the morning and evening star was just a different body, and there was some sort of association with Venus, which was definitely reinforced by contact with the Near East, since the Near East had already associated with that planet with the goddess Ishtar, who is a goddess of sexuality among the many things, so an obvious match for the Greek Aphrodite and the Roman Venus. So I don't really think there's any explicit identification between the Dioscuroi and the morning and evening star. It's more contextual, and I think it's not necessarily weird since Dioscuroi are clearly presented as being heroes, right? They are presented as part of the world of heroes, and so they are not necessarily on the same level as gods who may have power over the planets, right? There are also other kind of legends that eventually spawned up in which the constellation of Gemini was identified with the Castor and Pollux. There are also other constellations that have been tentatively been identified with the twins. So it's definitely interesting that in the Greek case, they still had some sort of astronomical and astrological association, but it took another path. They didn't seem to stick to the otherwise usual identification between these twins and the planet Venus.
Right, right. I mean, it's fascinating, definitely, because they're not like hard locked to the these particular stars across different traditions. So it's just fascinating that they kind of it's very clear in the Baltic, but in other places they have this ability to um, be separated from those stars or kind of transcend them in some sense, perhaps. So maybe it's just a reminder to us that these gods are more than just their star connection, right? Their celestial body connection. The god was above and beyond any given star in any case. So it's a good reminder, I think. Okay, any particular things in the Greek material that you'd like to go into? Any hymns?
Well, I mean, there are a couple hymns among the Homeric hymns, but I think that one of the more relevant passages is from the Iliad. This has also been discussed by Jameson and by Allen, so it's definitely worth looking at from a comparative perspective. Basically, we are dealing with Helen on the walls, lamenting her situation and listing the people that she can recognize. So she recognizes obviously her husband Menelaus. She recognizes Ajax, Odysseus, And then she ends up noticing that she is not able to see the two leaders of men, Castor, the horse tamer, and Pollux, good at fighting sports, right? Good at boxing. Who are her own two brothers. She obviously uses the typical poetic term for sibling, born to me from the same mother. So she she sort of has this inability to see them. She obviously does not imagine that they are actually dead. She assumes that they are just not there because they're ashamed of of being her siblings. But then obviously the narrator, who is omniscient, goes on to say that actually the nature producing earth, Pusidzos Aya, very poetic and very unusual construction, by the way, um, in Sparta, uh, actually hold them, right? Holds them in their fatherland, of course. So the implication is that they have died and have been buried. Now there's a whole question of whether burial or cremation was the original quote unquote way of burying dead people. In my opinion, it's not really a matter of which one is the more ancient or more traditional way. I think that in Homeric poems, it's really a matter of convenience. If someone dies away from their homeland, of course, transporting a dead body through the sea or through a long land voyage would be impractical, so they just burn the body and carry the ashes home. In the case of the Dioscuroi, we know that they still died in Greece, so it's not impossible that they have been just buried in the without being cremated first, but there's also no indication that they haven't been cremated. And now this obviously is important for a reason. The reason is that this passage inserts Castor and Pollux within the scheme of the Indo-European functions, right? So we have Menelaus representing the first function, we have Ajax for the second function, we have a bunch of heroes, but most specifically, the first function is Menelaus, the second is Ajax, and then Castor and Pollux uh, fit perfectly into the third function in Indo-European terms. That's also what we see with the Ashvin in Vedic materials, maybe with the Mitra Varunau sovereigns standing for the first function, and Indra or any of Indra's associates, such as Vishnu or Vayu, standing for the second function. So we see that pattern repeated here with heroes. And then there's a sort of a different way to present this twins situation in the Odyssey, right? There, I mean, we could open a whole question about whether the Iliad or the Odyssey are supposed to be in agreement, or they're just giving two different perspectives on the same situation. But what Odysseus relates that he saw during his journey to the underwood is that he saw Leda, of course, the wife of Tyndarus or Tyndareus. We can see both versions of the name thrown around in Greek and Latin, who gave birth from Tyndareus. So that's an interesting remark from the poet. They seem to be they seem to be both sons of her husband. Actually, the sources are not exactly on board with this paternity. We'll go into that later. But Castor, once again, the same exact wording: Castor, the horse tamer, and Pollux, good at boxing. Um, so then we once again have the same wording as the Iliad. The nature producing earth holds them both alive. Uh, they have a honor received from Zeus under the earth, and they live on alternate days, and on alternate days they die. Uh, they have received a honor equal to the gods. Now that is really interesting to me. Well, obviously not just to me, but I mean, It's really interesting because these twins apparently have been given a sort of split immortality. So they are alive one day and dead on another day. So obviously, what is this situation supposed to represent? Now, my humble interpretation is that this division between their partial mortality and partial immortality is actually a reflection of the level of initiation that they are allowed to have, right? This is actually paralleled in the Vedic material, in which we have the Ashvina, who are initially excluded from the other gods, right? They're seen as outsiders. They're always seen as too close to humans, um, and so not worthy of partaking in the mysteries of immortality together with the gods. They eventually, through a bunch of struggle, by the way, end up being accepted, but they're only accepted into a lesser degree of initiation compared to other gods. So it could be understood as the third function uh, being given some sort of access to the mysteries, but not complete access that would be obviously given only to the higher case, to the higher function. So either only the first function or both the first and the second. And so obviously that should be contrasted with deities from other functions who get a different treatment. Obviously, talking about deities in the Greek case does not give us a parallel for their death because deities don't die ever in Greek mythology. But we do have one interesting example in Heracles. Heracles, who has some parallels with Indra, and that has been argued by Dumézil among the many. So, so it's definitely worth looking at in this context. And Heracles actually enjoys a different kind of split immortality. So his shadow, according to the Odyssey once again, is fully in Hades, but also he himself is fully on Olympus and is truly a god, married to Hebe, to the goddess of youth, and treated just as any other god. So in both the case of Heracles and the case of the twins, the Dioscuroi, we have a sort of split immortality, a sort of co-presence of immortality and mortality. But in the case of the Ashvinau, or well, in this case of the Dioscuroi, it's a lesser degree. The Dioscuroi cannot have continuous, perpetual immortality. They can only be afforded temporary immortality, one day of immortality and one day of being dead, or well, alive under the earth, if anything. So that I think is also paralleling the cycle of reincarnation, right? In the cycle of reincarnation, you can have one existence on earth and then go back to the house of the fathers, right? In it might be identified with the moon or with the realm of Hades, and there are a bunch of ways to go about it. But they basically can return to a state of not being incarnated and then go back to being incarnated once again. So this can go over and over again, potentially forever, as opposed to other heroes' paths in which they eventually achieve a more complete form of godhood, the way Heracles set them up to, right? Obviously, Heracles is a warrior, so second function, which in the hierarchy of Indo-Europeans was considered to be above the third function, and thus obviously could be expected to have a better situation, not only in the social hierarchy of Indo-Europeans, but also their expectation for the afterlife, for possible apotheosis, right? So that's a very interesting, I think, way to look at it. Of course, any criticism is accepted. Now, back to the issue of paternity, it's really interesting how, for instance, this is framed in one Homeric hymn in which they are said to be Tyndaridas. So they are the sons of Tyndareus, there's no doubt about it, except that they are begotten by Zeus, right? Them, the Olympian Zeus begat, um, and the lady Leda, I mean, it's funny in the English translation, but it's not sounding like that in Greek, Potnia Lede, um, gave birth to them. under the peaks of Taygetos, so the mountain that is in Sparta. Of course, it's implying the Spartan birth. Having been privily, says this English translation, but I would say even hiddenly um, seduced. But seduced is actually kind of a mild word. Here, the translation has bent to his will, but the literal translation would be actually tamed. The Greek understanding of marriage or sexual intercourse is that the man is supposed to, quote unquote, tame the woman. Uh, Somewhat cruel, but that's what Zeus does to Leda, right? So, having been tamed by the um, dark clouded son of Cronus. That's really interesting to look at. So in this version of the story, their putative father is Tyndareus, but then they're also both legally sons of Tyndareus and both legally sons of Zeus, contrasting with the Odyssey, in which they're just plainly both sons of Tyndareus. So obviously, this dual paternity was often resolved with the idea of a dual paternity, right? In which one also this other hymn does not specify that, but the idea of dual paternity. So Pollux being the son of Zeus and Castor being the son of Tyndareus, in such a way that each of the twins had a different father while still sharing the same mother. And that's obviously discounting the version in which the children of Tyndareus and Leda are actually begotten by neither. They are begotten by Zeus and the goddess Nemesis, and they spring from eggs that the goddess Nemesis, in the form of a bird, ends up laying in Leda's house. So that there's a whole other kind of worm for alternate versions of the myth. That the dual paternity version does seem to have parallels in the Rig Veda, right? So it's possible that this was also originally, if not Proto-Indo-European, at least Proto-Greco-Aryan. That's a usual term used in linguistics, but I think we can easily extend it to mythology. Uh, and so, obviously, this motif, this idea of the dual paternity of the horsemen twins, that could explain their complicated relationship with humans and with the gods and with immortality in general, right? Implying that one of them was more connected to the realm of the gods and the other more to the realm of mortals by virtue of having different fathers, regardless of the mother, who is usually the same.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. And I can build on that if you'd like, and kind of bridge to the other branches, unless you had another text or anything you wanted to bring up before we move on.
Okay, just actually one quick comment about some other texts before we move on. Okay,
Wait,
so in this other, a bit longer Homeric hymn, the main topic is that the Dioscuroi help people in ship voyages, right? They help them at sea. Now, I think that this
hi.
is
Very important.
relevant comparatively because Proto-Indo-European peoples were probably not seafarers at first, but in Greek thought, the ship is sort of analogous to chariots, right? To the idea is even is that sea voyage is analogous to chariot voyage in some way. So it's possible that this is a specialization in a maritime society, since Greeks were obviously so close to the sea and kind of had to use the sea since they didn't have much arable land. And this is a specialization of a Proto-Indo-European association between the horsemen twins and chariots, which are obviously drawn by horses. And obviously, Castor is called horse tamer, so it would make sense for a horse tamer to be associated with chariots that are obviously yoked to horses and drawn by horses. And then looking at specifically at the Ashvin as helping people. I mean, this is one of, of the generic examples, but it's actually interesting because in this example from Rig Veda Book 1, the Nasatyas, this is just another name for the Ashvinau. They can be called in with a bunch of names. So Nasatya is one of the more common ones. they actually help a king to have a son, right? So their association with procreation, fertility could be relevant here. And then we have again from book one another interesting passage in which Vishpali, whose identity is actually unclear, it's unknown whether she's a human or a deity, or well, probably not a deity, but or a horse. That's literally one of the possibilities. Um, she was basically she had a leg severed during a battle, and she was helped by the Ashvinau, who gave her an iron leg. Now, actually, I don't know whether iron is actually the term used in the original. Let me see. Uh, Probably it means generically metal rather than specifically iron. But still, the idea that they can come to the help in battle, and maybe specifically of a female horse, depending on the interpreter of the verse that you ask, is really interesting to me. Also, maybe some association with medicine, but we don't really see that too much with the Greek Dioskuroi. If anything, we see the twin sons of Asclepius. They are Podalirius and Machaon. They are actually twins and doctors. So maybe there has been a doubling of horsemen twins. Castor and Pollux retaining the chariot and horse associations, and Podalirius and Machaon keeping the medical associations. In principle, one could also assume that there has been maybe a conflation in the Vedic case, but I mean, obviously, being heroes, it's easier for the Greek characters to be seen as different sets of twins that are interpreted as incarnations of the same original deities, right? Whereas assuming that the Ashvin are a conflation seems kind of against Occam's razor in this case. So
So,
these are just my quick commentary on these texts that I brought up.
yeah. So you
It,
mean, sorry, could you clarify, assuming that they're a conflation, the Ashvinau are a conflation, um, could you clarify what you meant by that?
yeah, so the idea is that obviously, since in the Greek case we have different pairs of twins, we have both Castor and Pollux, and then we have a separate set of twins who are related to medicine. One could maybe make the argument that the Ashvinau, who are related to both medicine and other things, could have been a conflation of these two pairs of twins, but that would probably be against the
Got it.
Occam's razors.
Hmm.
So it's more likely that the Greek side innovated, and not necessarily in a way that contrasted with tradition, but quite simply because in the Greek case we're talking about heroes, and heroes obviously um, can be numerically multiplied, right? There can be many different heroes who respond to the same deity. Just as we have Polynices in the Theban War and Menelaus in the Trojan War, and I would argue that they both, to some degree, represent a Mitra type, but obviously they represent the Mitra type in different contexts, right? It's also relevant that in the Trojan War, as we have noted from the Iliad passage, the only Iliad mention of the Dioskuroi, the Dioskuroi are actually not present. So necessarily other people have to step in, other heroes, right, have to step in and fill the third function, horseman twin role for the epic to work. So in the medical case, more specifically, Podalirius and Machaon. In other instances, the horseman twin role is probably best represented by Odysseus and Diomedes. There are probably also other twins, but these two pairs are the main ones in the context of the Trojan War, just as the Dioskuroi might be, and especially Castor and Pollux, as the individual Dioskuroi, uh, might be in other contexts, right?
Yeah,
Just
that
in
makes,
the keepings, we also have different incarnations of the Ashvina as well. Obviously, the best known one is Nakula and Sahadeva in the context of the Mahabharata in the Kurukshetra war.
right. That makes perfect sense to me. So thank you for clarifying. And just so I think I can just kind of build on that a little bit here. So I'm gonna So I think it can it can be argued, right, that it's a pretty clear, direct parallel between the Dioskuroi and the Ashvinau, and both of those to the Dieva Deli of the Baltic. The names are almost, they're very comparable, at least. As we will see here, the what is the word here? Devo. So the Ashvinau are also called the Devo Napata. So that is comparable to the Dieva Deli, Dievo Sunelai of the Lithuanian, Dioskuroi. Okay, so there's a pretty clear continuity. I think it's a pretty easy parallel to accept that the horse twins of the Vedic are equivalent to the boys of Zeus, the sons of Zeus or sons of Dievo. And in the West, is there? Do you think there is an equivalent, comparable amount of horse connections for the Dioskuroi and these others in the West?
Well, I did mention both the connection with ships and sea voyage being seen obviously as a sort of sea equivalent of horses, right? And
Yeah,
also, Castor is always called in nearly every occurrence the horse tamer.
right,
So
right. I think
that's
that was one of
pretty
the
pretty
keys.
strong. I
Yeah,
usually don't like calling the Ashvinau horse twins because they are not said to be horses most of the
yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
I would rather see them as horsemen, right?
Right,
Ashvinau is an adjective derivation from Ashva, meaning horse. The same is true for the Baltic names, which are pretty much linguistically the same. So
right.
yeah, they're horsemen in the sense that they're closely associated with horses. Their job is caring about horses, taming
Mhm.
horses, driving horses, but obviously they are not necessarily horses themselves.
That's a great point. Very important. And yeah, of course, I just used that term for its conventional um, comprehensibility for so people know who I'm talking about. It is this type that's called the horse twins. But the Ashvins themselves in the Vedas, yeah, they're not being described as like horse-headed usually, as far as I know. Um, so that's an interesting topic about kind of where that more um, emphatic like horse form of the Ashvins comes in. So that would be an interesting question to see, because of course we do have like Hengist and Horsa in the West that seem to be directly identified with horse names. It's sort of an open question there, how that evolved, right? But okay, but that's an important point. I do think I go into in my book a lot of these kind of difficult questions a little bit more in detail and at length, which I can't always get across in streams. But I do go into, like you mentioned, Diomedes and Odysseus seem to they work together in the Iliad in a way comparable to some of like the Ashvins and Dioskuroi, how they're kind of a team and they are doing things and they are playing a role in sort of the hierarchy and in the tasks they do that could be interpreted as, you know, they are drawing from the deeper ancient mythos of the horse twins and incarnating some of that mythos in the way that epic heroes do, right? So that's what I argue for in my book, that Odysseus and Diomedes are kind of playing the role here. And part of that is, yeah, Diomedes is like the most youthful of the heroes. He's the youngest. That is like the young, the horse twins are like the young god, the young sun, and all of that. And also, they are crafty and they are on these kinds of. They have this sort of crafty intelligence, which seems to come through in Odysseus. But yeah, that is obviously an interesting and an interesting question that is dependent on a lot of interpretation. So there are different ways you can go with that. But the point of that is that Diomedes has perhaps some horse associations in in his cult. There are hero cults, of course, in ancient Greece around Iliad heroes and others, and there is perhaps more mention of some of the horse connections. They might survive through like Diomedes and maybe Odysseus as well. But yeah, there is like I think there was
Well, I
a
mean,
horse
in the case of
sacrificed to
Odysseus,
Diomedes. What was that?
yeah, no, in the case of Odysseus, there's
Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
the most
yes,
close connection to a horse that anyone could imagine, since
yeah,
Odysseus in one minor myth gets turned into a horse.
yes. And
So
Nick Allen
Alan
goes into that. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah, but
exactly.
besides that,
Why did Odysseus turn into a horse? Is one of Nick Allen's articles or something like that.
yeah, I mean that's pretty funny, and
Yeah,
few classicists know about it. But even so, there's also the issue that Diomedes was heavily worshipped in the south of Italy, where horse sacrifice was prevalent, and
ah,
so it was generally assumed that Diomedes taught them the horse sacrifice,
right. Okay.
possibly as a remembrance of the Trojan horse, right?
Hmm.
Rome also had its own horse sacrifice, but it was generally attributed to the Aeneas, so the Trojan contingent that came to Italy, and not to the Diomedes.
Right. Okay. That's great. Fascinating context. So I would just like to suggest that it's possible um, that some of this horse associations could have survived through the heroic incarnations like Diomedes and Odysseus, right? So that's something to look into more. And I do mention a couple instances like that horse sacrifice connection in my book, as well as, of course, the Trojan horse is Odysseus's idea. So that's, could be a coincidence, could be an association, hard to say. So with that, let's touch. Yeah, did anyone have any thoughts on that? Or I'm gonna.
Well, beyond the horse association, I remember I don't have it pulled up, and it's not definitive, but there is an etymology. There's an old root believed where the name Nasatya comes from that means to return home safely, as another interesting parallel with Odysseus,
Yeah,
especially since if so they're collectively called the Nasatyas, but Nasatya is also the name of one of them, the primary one, which is invoked at Nakula's birth, who directly parallels Odysseus in your book, I believe.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. That's a
so
great one to bring up.
yeah, but we can move on from there. I just wanted to bring
Yeah,
that up.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So they are all about returning home safely, retrieving the lost light, and returning home, helping people return home safely, especially. And Odysseus is the one who has the long journey where he returns home safely. Okay, so that is a possible survival. I think there are questions about whether that is applicable or not, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
Is it,
specifically as nostos, which is the Greek word for return, and specifically for the returns of heroes after the Trojan War, is actually a cognate of the name Nasatya. So definitely that
mhm,
makes it a bit more
yeah,
interesting to look into as a sort of linguistic association. It doesn't have necessarily to be uh, a proof of any equivalence between any character that has any connection to that root, but it
exactly.
definitely does seem to show that there's maybe a connection between these horsemen, the idea of returning generally, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And as a sort of counterexample, there is the theory. There's a theory by the scholar Douglas Frame that I go into in my book, where he is trying to argue that Nestor, and Nestor is also referred to as Hippota Nestor, and that means horseman Nestor, essentially, I think. And he's arguing that Hippota Nestor, it's from the same root as, you know, Ashvin Nasatya, horseman Nasatyas. So that Nasatya and Nestor are actually from the same root word, and it is potentially this same word that we were just discussing, connected to nostos and returning home. Okay, so that's his argument, and I go into actually, I go into in my book trying to critique and counter that argument that this sort of linguistic connection really is not enough. And you have to approach it from what myths, what actual mythic role they're playing and the survival of the details of their myths, to me, it doesn't shake out. It seems to me there can be these coincidences, right? Where this root word Nestor for Nestor and Nasatya, it is a important and common word that's used in different places, and then the concept of being a horseman can then be attached to that. Those names can diverge in different traditions and be attached to actually different heroes or gods. So that's something to watch out for, right, with these linguistic things. And you have, in his argument, you have the oldest figure. Nestor is like this ancient, extreme embodiment of old age figure, and he is arguing that he comes from the same mythos as the horse twin type deity originally, and the horse twin deity is the embodiment of extreme youth, of the youngest of the gods. And so it's this kind of it's a complicated thing where he's trying to say that Nestor comes from an earlier mythic cycle, right? So he was he's old now in the Iliad, but he wasn't always old. So he it could have been kind of carried through until he's old, but it becomes kind of complicated for me. And yeah, I don't know what you thought about Douglas Frame's argument on that. Do you think it holds water, or do you think Nestor plays a different role? I guess that's a complete other tangent, but you can see my argument at least in my book where I try to go into that. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
So I think that some of Frame's arguments are actually interesting to look into. I did cite him in my thesis, so I mean that's definitely interesting to look into. But yeah, I ultimately do not buy the idea that Nestor is one of the horsemen twins.
Yeah, that's my main disagreement. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole issue about Nestor, in my understanding of the evidence, also as brought up by Frame, is that his old age. Well, actually, this is openly stated by Hyginus, by the way, the Roman mythographer. His old age and his extremely long life is due to the fact that his brothers were killed prematurely, and Apollo decided that the years that were not lived by the brothers would be lived by Nestor. So that's a whole different dynamic to the split immortality of the Dioscuroi, which seem to be together, alternating one day alive and one day in death, although even here some versions seem to disagree with that. So I think it's sort of a different situation, and it does tie well into the idea of a substitutive sacrifice, the idea that obviously it was usually an animal victim, but sometimes a human victim could be killed to prevent death or other misfortune from happening to a living person. So it's just another kind of war, right? Right. There's also the issue of formularity, right? So I don't think it's a coincidence that Hippota Nestor and Ashvin Nasatya are both couplings of the word for horseman and a word related to returning. It's not a coincidence, but it's simply due to the formulaic nature of Indo-European poetry. Yeah. Poets always reuse the same collocations in oral poetry, of course, since that also helps them with memorizing long lines of poetry and transmitting them to the next generation. And it's sort of a fixed way of saying things, right? It's a collocation, it's a formula. And obviously this formula or collocation can be given new semantic shadows, can be played upon, and so obviously can also end up giving names to characters that are not necessarily equal, right? So that's,
yes,
I agree with you on this, of course.
Very well put. That's exactly what I would think as well. That's kind of how I see it. So so that's a counterexample that came to mind just now because Frame uses this word nostos and the whole concept of the return home after the war, and he argues how Nestor is kind of a key part of that, guiding, prophesying and guiding the return home of Menelaus and the others. But of course, that's a broad thing. Odysseus also is returning home, and he has a very large story about his return home. So it's sort of a cautionary counterexample that yes, this can be an interesting concept to try to map here, but also it's very broad. So be careful about how that is used. Okay. So all right, I'm gonna just try to bridge here to the Germanic and Celtic material. So so what I was saying is, it's pretty easy to see these twins like the Dioscoroi matching with the Ashvin twins, and then the Baltic twins as well. They have a consistent names, as well as being twins or being a pair in all of these cases, essentially. But I think when we get into trying to compare to Western European, Northern European rather, traditions, Northwest, like Germanic and Celtic, that we run into a massive, significant difficulty, which is, what if the survival of this god type wasn't always consistently shown as two twin deities? You have to be prepared for the possibility of significant changes like this, and able to identify when they've happened. So this issue becomes clear when Dumicil argues his case for why Freyr is probably the parallel of the Ashvins, because Freyr has this story of the Aesir Vanir War, where he has to try to overcome the high gods, the first function gods, in a battle, and then he, at the end of that, becomes the priest of their sacrifice, actually, as it says in the Norse material, in the Eddas. And that is the framework. And then there is, of course, the creation of the being who embodies the mead, which is Kvasir. And then in the same story, or in the equivalent story of Chavana and the Ashvins, we have Chavana creating the being who is the embodiment of the drunkenness of the mead, which is Mada. And so, that is, as we went into in the Soma stream, that is Dumicil's basic parallel, and it's very strong. It's a very strong parallel, and I go into more detail on that. But Dumicil argues, of course, that the twin motif, to him, he's making quite a sort of a vague and speculative argument on this particular point, but he argues that Freyr and his father Njordur might be the survival of the two gods, right? The twins. But I go into how that kind of falls apart. First of all, it's a father and son that's fairly dramatically different. Okay, so he might not be entirely correct on that. When you go into it further, it appears that Njordur is in the same role as Chavana in the parallel myth. So in the parallel myth, of course, we have Chavana and the two Ashvins who help Chavana, and then Chavana helps them back to defeat Indra and join the sacrifice. And Chavana creates the being Mada, of the intoxication of the mead. In the Norse story, you have Njordur and his son Freyr, and they together are the leaders of the Vanir, who defeat the Aesir and then join their sacrifice, as the Freyr becomes the priest of their sacrifice, and they are allowed to join, which is explicitly mentioned in the Ursula Dronke argues that it's being implied that they were being kept out of the sacrifice as well, of the Aesir, because they were too common, essentially, and that parallels directly why the Ashvins were being kept out of the sacrifice, all of that. So when you go further and you identify the parallel between Njordur's marriage myth, Njordur marrying Skavi, and that being directly part of the story of the apples that renew the youth of the gods, and the removal of the eyes of Thjazi. This all is paralleled by Chavana's marriage myth, where the herb that renews his youth is brought in, and his eye is poked out. There's an eye poking out. And then there is, in the marriage of Njordur versus the marriage of Chavana, in both of them, the conclusion of the marriage is that the wife has to try to identify which husband she's going to marry, among, kind of blind without being able to fully see who they are in a magical choosing test among a set of deities, right? Skadi tries to select her husband and thinks she's selecting Baldur, I believe, and but it's actually Njordur, and then she marries Njordur. In the story of Chavana, Sukanya has to pick her husband out between Chavana and the two Ashvins when I guess he has just had his youth renewed, so it's hard for her to identify him in that sense, and she selects Chavana. Okay, all of that parallels between Chavana and Njordur. So then, because of that, we realize, I think, that if Freyr does parallel the Ashvins, he does so more or less alone as the sole primary representation of this type of god, who parallels the Ashvins. Okay, so from that, this possibility has to be confronted, I think, that sometimes the Ashvin type of god, the horse twin type of god, didn't necessarily survive as a pair of twins. Okay, so because of that, I go into this a bit in my book to try to give some evidence of how this is actually a complicated picture, even in Indo-Iranic material. Okay, so I'm just going to read from this short passage. It will be quickly noticed that for many of the cases we are analyzing, only one horse twin is identifiable. This holds true for the Irish Angus, Scandinavian Freyr, and the Welsh Pryderi. The Vedic Ashvins themselves had become so unitary that they were referred to by only this single name, and they did most everything together, acting essentially as one. So this could be a factor in how this happens. If a pair of gods is treated as always doing things together, it could be easy to find them reduced to one, right, over time in the stories that they have. In the Iranic version, this god also appears in singular form rather than as a set of twins, and that is the Nanghaithya. And so I have that on the chart. Nanghaithya, it's a direct linguistic equivalent of Nasatya in the Avestan material, but it is referring clearly to just one figure now even in the Iranic. So you can see even in these closely connected cultures, the Iranic, Avestan, and the Vedic, there is difference over this specific point. Was it really just one deity or was it two? Okay, so all right. It also appears possible that this singular form is actually more archaic than the twin form, though this question remains open. So I would really like to emphasize that is very open. I'm not saying necessarily that the singular was the more archaic, but it is interesting that there is this sort of back and forth or lack of clarity on this point. So as Hartmut Scharf observes, quote, only in India do we find two Nasatyas, whereas the Avesta mentions just a singular Nanghaithya. It seems, though, that in the latter case, the Avesta is more archaic. Rig Veda 4.3.6 once has the name in the singular Nasatyaya, and once Rig Veda 8.26.8 in a dual form Indra Nasatya. O Indra and Nasatya, implying a single Nasatya. In the Brihadevata 7.6 CD, similar Mahabharata 12:201-17 AB, we find a tradition that Nasatya and Dasra are known as the two Ashvins. The dual Nasatya, Rigveda 1.173.4, refers to Nasatya and his twin. Nasatya and his twin. So that the point of that is that there could be this main figure called Nasatya originally, like one main one who's really important, and then his twin off to the side who can be kind of minimized. So that's the point of that last one. So see his article Rigveda, Avesta, and Beyond, page 61. So Scharf concludes that originally the primary horse god Nasatya may have been a chariot warrior, while his charioteer may have been seen as his twin. Hence, one of the two could have gained much more prominence than the other in certain branches. In these other branches, the charioteer could not have been recognized or could have been pushed aside. In the Greek case, only one of the two Dioscuri is fully divine. Okay, Josephus went into this in more specific and accurate detail, but just to get the basic point across. And thus, one is again more important than the other, as he also touched on. They too are called by a unifying moniker, of course, the Dioscoroi. In the Roman legend, that Dumisil shows to be the euhemerized equivalent to the Aesir-Vanir War, that is the rape of the Sabine women. A single figure, Titus Tatius, stands in for the third function, at least, the horse twin role that could be equivalent. We can theorize that in the Celtic and Germanic cases, either the second horse twin never was recognized, became seen as less important, unimportant, and was pushed aside, or that he became absorbed into the dominant horse twin in the myths, or again, that the second twin simply hasn't been clearly identified as of yet, possibly even being demoted to a secondary character in the mythology. We cannot even rule out the possibility that a prominent single horse god is the more archaic form, as the Avestan version appears more archaic, according to Scharf at least. Yeah, I would say that's impossible to know with certainty. There could be a good debate about that evidence that Scharf even brings there. It even seems possible that in the Welsh case, the second twin may have become or been seen as the first twin's horse. And yeah, I only say that because Pryderi is born the same night as a horse is raised alongside this horse, and the horse becomes his own when they are grown. So is that a survival of him being the twin of a horse? It is now reduced to his horse. Or is that just a symbolic connection of him to horses because he's the lord of horses? So, okay, there's different ways you could read that. In general, we should remember, of course, that a twin is no less of a twin when the other twin is not present. So we will continue to use this well-recognized conventional name. Okay. Ultimately, it seems that whereas the Vedic twins are primarily known by the title the Sons of God, Divo Napata, and as ever youthful, the Northwestern European cases are instead characterized by the epithet the young son. So this is, I guess in this case, just the Celtic cases, we have the Mabon and the Mac-Indoch rather than Mac-Och, but yeah, Angus Mac-Och is, so Mac-Och is his second part of his name, right? And that just means the young son. So we have figures that they are called, instead of being called the sons of God, they still have son in their name, right? But they're the young son. Their youth is emphasized rather than who their father specifically is. The divine sons simply became the divine son, apparently, but their status as ever youthful divine sons remained central to their nomenclature and identity. Okay, so yeah, Stig Vikander argues the second and more domestic horse twin could have been merged with Atar, the fire deity. Okay, so there are other ways that the second deity could have been merged into a different deity in the Ironic material that could explain that. So there's a lot of different complex ways this evidence could be looked at, but you can see how we can't assume that just because we can't assume that in the Celtic and Germanic branches that this deity type, just because the conventional name is horse twin, that they had to survive as twins. Okay, it's hard for some people to wrap their minds around that or accept that. I think people may want to look for twins, and if they're not there, then they're not the horse twins. But we are arguing much more for the core of this mythos survived, and the outward representation of whether it was one or two could change and shift. And from that, I want to point out that in my book, I go into a much longer sort of investigation, detective work in hunting down in the Welsh material the fact that there seem to be traces of a brother or twin of the sort of euhemerized version of this god type. If that is true, it would suggest, I think, that originally in the Welsh and probably the Celtic, there may have been a twin who then kind of got reduced. So that could be the more likely scenario from that evidence. So what I mean by that is we have Pryderi, who seems to be in this equivalent of Freyr role, and therefore we're deducing that they are continuous with this god type, the young sun, Pryderi. And we can go into some of this, why this is the case, why Pryderi is the equivalent. But Pryderi then appears in euhemerized pseudo-history texts as Peredurus, it seems, Peredur. So Peredur and Peredurus seem to be an alternate name of Pryderi. We then have specific cases that I cite where Peredurus appears in a sequence of sons, of brothers, who seem to be the euhemerized gods. And there are 2 or 3 brothers before him that are born and rule as the king. Then when Peredurus he's kind of like the youngest son in the sequence, when he is born and rises to prominence, he is there with a brother right alongside him doing the same things with him, and that figure is named Eugenius. There are different manuscripts. This is a whole issue I go into in my book, but his name is either Eugenius or Owainius. And so this points to the fact that we have this name Owain, also in the Welsh material. And then Owain appears sometimes kind of in the same equivalent roles with the figure Mabon, and Mabon is the name for that we went into for the other name for the horse twin. So there's this whole complex web, but I do want to point out to people who are interested in this topic that I think there's evidence that there's this sort of pushed aside but yet surviving fragments of material about Peredurus having a twin-like brother who's paired with him, and therefore there was probably a deeper, more ancient understanding of even the Celtic figures being twins, but that has kind of been obscured, and for some reason that tended to happen in the Celtic material and the Germanic. So it's fascinating, and it's really mysterious kind of what happened exactly. But we do have Freyr just kind of as a solo figure holding this role. So Arno, I would like to ask you if there's one or the other of the Germanic versus the Celtic that you'd like to kind of like dig into and look at more closely first, and yeah, we could kind of talk about that. What do you think would be best to bridge to?
I can cover the Germanic stuff briefly.
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
the
sounds
Celtic
good.
stuff will be more in depth, but I agree that it seems intuitive to me and pretty simple that the original understanding would have been 2 horse twins with one being immortal and the other mortal, and that I think it's kind of apparent from Welsh material as well that the not fully immortal twin became like mythically insignificant over time to some people.
Yeah.
Because really it's what you were reading from earlier says the only place we can find 2 is in India. Aside from Nanghaithia, which Zoroastrian
Yeah.
religious reformation is an outlier.
Yes.
On its own.
I mean, you're totally right. Like that is just him narrowly focusing on the Indo-Iranic sphere, not doing actual broad comparative mythology. But it's still just
Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting that there is perhaps this. It's an example of, yes, it's like a definitive example that yes, this god type can get reduced to one god. So we can kind of like put it off the table that it's not an impossibility. We can't act like it's impossible for this to happen because we have evidence that it can happen. Okay.
Yeah, when you go broader, it's really just Angus, Freyr, and Nanghaithia, which I wouldn't pair together with Freyr and Angus in terms of why they appear singular. But just like with so many other traditions, the more heroic tradition experiences none of the, for lack of a better term, reformations that the religious mythic material will, and often is more conservative. You have Hengist and Horsa is, I don't know about any sort of mythic deeds they do that is very similar, but they're twins who are both named after the words for horse. Kind of hard to say they're not horse twins. But leaving them aside, when we talked about Hadding as Soma parallel or Njordr parallel, there are continental Germanic heroic epics where he has 2 sons called the Hedingyar, who often join retinues of knights or berserkers. And then there's also Tacitus, I believe, mentioned the Alkai, that were the twins that were very similar to Castor and Pollux that were worshipped. So you still have twins, horse twins in the Germanic material. It's just that Freyr. I personally think Freyr must have been in some way influenced from some sort of Celtic understanding of Angus as a singular horse twin in very ancient times. I can't prove that though.
It's definitely possible. Like I was just kind of mentioning, it's interesting that there seems to be a survival of the twin idea in the Celtic material, yet at the same time, we have this broad phenomenon of them being reduced to one that covers across the Germanic and the Celtic very consistently. It's very interesting why that would be the case. So that's one possible way that could have happened for sure.
Yeah, and there's also two horses that are named that pull the chariot of the sun, named Yorwaker and Allswith, or like All Fast. Right. And that Yorwaker, that is a naming element used in one of the names of Freyr, referring to like the year, as in like harvest. I believe because he's called like Orgod, which means your or year god, just like this horse. So I have no idea if that's because every pagan tradition has horses, pulling the chariot of the sun. But I'm just showing how you have like Hengist and Horsa, these two horses that pull the sun. The Hadingyar brothers, who I believe are said to be twins, the Alkai twins that were worshipped according to Roman sources.
Yeah, that's the Alkai, Alkis. That's a really good example. Of
it might be from the word for elk, because another son of Hadding Frothi is called Elgfrothi or Elkfrothi elsewhere, who I also believe is a heroic version of Freyr. So that all kind of fits together. So like, you do have plenty of examples of actual horse twins or brothers in Germanic stuff. I think Gaelic is the only one that just seems to have a singular horse twin through and through.
Yeah, and the thing is, they do have this story of the Macha, and when she gives birth to the horse. Let's see, she gives birth to the two twins, the twins of Macha. So that's something that some people have pointed to as a possible. So let me just pull this up if I can. Oops. Okay. So she races against horses, right? You know the story, of course. And so the Macha races against horses as if she's a horse, and then she gives birth to twins. And so I guess that isn't like entirely clear. It's not like blatantly that her children are horses, but it's like a horse. It's a mother goddess who's being kind of acting like a horse, then giving birth to twins. So there could be a horse identity.
Yeah, well, I think the Brythonic version of that is Pryderi's birth.
Exactly.
By Rhiannon so Quick, because her husband in the Gaelic, Macha's husband Crunic, kind of makes a bet on her behalf, and she races against Conar's horses, and she's very upset about it and curses everybody after she wins and gives birth. Whereas Puich also, I forget, you will remember a lot better. He does something where he like messes up. He says something he's not supposed to say, and like it causes her a bunch of grief, and ends up in Pryderi being born and taken. But yeah, I'm not sure, because I remember we talked about that a little bit in the Godiva episode. There's like an eloquent and an ineloquent one, and that. But I'm just forgetting the full.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I'd have to zero in on which part of the story we're talking about. I'm not quite remembering, but it's just it shows this story of the Macha. It shows a possible survival of that twin element that that outwardly is not there in the Gaelic. It could be kind of in these traces, right? So the other interesting thing with that is we have Angus Og as apparently, we can deduce from the story The Dream of Angus how much that seems like a direct mirror of Skirnis Mall when Skirnir woos on behalf of Freyr, and that puts Angus and Freyr into direct equivalency. So it seems a pretty clear thing that a parallel that we can build that I go into in my book, of course. But we have Angus Og, also known as the Mac Indog, and or the Mac Enoch, and we have him as kind of the main figure holding this spot. But we also have in the more kind of legendary, well, I think you could call them even more euhemerized tales connected to kings and things. We have the name Owen or Owain come up in the Gaelic material as well. So we saw this kind of, it pops up, it appears connected to Peredurus as his brother, his twin-like brother, his name Owainus, and also Owain, paralleling with the Mabon in some of the Welsh poems and things. So we have this name, and then it appears in the Gaelic, and it is Owen who appears in a story that seems to directly parallel Freyr. So this was kind of like I kind of went through this detective process of identifying Owen as the other, maybe like the other name, the second name of the second brother. And then it pops up in the Gaelic material, of course, right? So that would imply that maybe Angus was originally the name of one of the brothers, and Owen was the name of the other brother. Like they're two separate. Potentially, they're pointing to the two separate brothers, but in different stories, one of the names was used as encompassing the entire role. So that's one way this could have happened, because when we get to the story of Owen in some of the material, we went into this in the Purusha stream, but his story directly parallels Freyr's story when Freyr fights Surt in the end times. So yeah, you recall that parallel, right, Arno? Where
Lugan of the Red Sword leads to the death of Owen unarmed.
Yes,
which was also in the Gesta Danorum of Swearting doing the same thing within the sacred space of a ritual where weapons aren't allowed, killing Frothi, the son of Heading. So yeah, I mean, yeah, you've got that. I think the Dream of Angus and Skirnis Mall is probably one of the closest one-to-one parallels there is. Yeah, so I think Freyr and Angus are particularly like so close together. And I think you still do have the cosmological aspects to their whole myth cycle present there. I think it's much more present, or at least obvious, in the Brythonic material, and then elsewhere, like Greek stuff with Odysseus going and coming back, being like a daily cycle. Crossing the sea is like nighttime. Anyways, I'm kind of getting a little too ahead of myself.
Yeah. There's so much once you open this. There's just so much across these, especially in Celtic and Germanic. It's so spread out. There are so many points we could go to, but it's so fascinating as well. I just found it fascinating that you can go into the Brythonic stuff and identify this name Owen. You can bounce it back to the Gaelic and realize it appears there, and then it perfectly predicts. It's like you built this model and then suddenly it perfectly predicts, that when you find the parallel of Freyr fighting Surt, which we knew already that Lugith Macon, that Lugith was this name for the Surt type, and the one who Lugith fights in this sort of disarmed scene is Owen. So Owen just pops up in the exact place where the kind of model predicted, and he is then filling that role comparable to Freyr. So very interesting. And yeah, like in terms of the cycle, though, so if we can kind of establish that you can go into, like, we don't need to step through, I think, every single parallel, because this is the horse twins and the Grail, I call it, and the lunar cycle in my book. It's the longest section of my my book, and my book's like 550 pages, and this is like 150 pages of it or something like that. Okay, so we can't go through every detail, but if you start with Freyr paralleling the Ashvins in the story of Chavana, and how we kind of describe that, the god who is kind of the third function associated more with the common people in some way, powers of connected to fertility in some way, in some cases, although not always. The Ashvins are still warrior gods. That should be clear. So those things get complicated. But then if you build from that, the parallel of Freyr to Angus in particular, they have this very direct parallel via the Dream of Angus and Skirnusmal, this wooing tale, as well as the fact that Angus's foster father, rather, Mither, who he thinks is his real father at first. Actually, he's raised by Mither, as if he's his father. Mither's story parallels Chavana once again and parallels Njordr. So we can see that the father figure of Freyr is equivalent to the father figure of Angus, Njordr, and Mither, and they are then, that's kind of the Soma god type that we went into previously. And they have this whole mythos with the poking out of the eye mythos and the choosing test of the spouse, usually even connected with water. The choosing test occurs in or around water, and there's this wooing, there's this pursuit of the sun princess, and then that's kind of mirrored down into Angus's story, where he pursues his own sun princess. As we said in the beginning of this stream, the sun princess is wedded to multiple deities, and these kind of branch off into their own stories, but in like different incarnations of the sun princess. It's very fascinating. So it seems that when Mither woos Aidin in the wooing of Aidin, right, that is the sun princess Surya, just exactly comparable to Soma marrying Surya in the Rig Veda, and then Angus marrying Caer. That is, if in the Dream of Angus and having to woo her, this is another instantiation of the same underlying goddess deity, the sun princess, aka the Vedic Surya, directly comparable to when the Ashvins also marry a sun princess. Okay, so we saw that in the beginning. That is continuous into the Baltic, and it appears to be the same in these other branches, but in this coded way where they're kind of branching off into their own stories. From there, we can see that I think you can zero in on what is the Aesir-Vanir War parallel, and in like the Celtic material. And I think people go wrong because a lot of times they just look at what are the big wars, what are the big battles, because this is Aesir-Vanir War. It's supposed to be a war, right? So I've seen commentators often try to identify like the Battle of Moytura as the Aesir-Vanir War, or the battle with the Firbolg and things like that. And so this is, I think, a big mistake, because there is a core, like, what's important about the Aesir-Vanir War? What's important about the Aesir-Vanir War is what it's specifically about and who it's between, what the battle is over, and like its mythic theological role. Okay, so that is much when you compare that with the Vedic one, you can see that it's about these third function gods trying to join the higher function deities, the kings of the gods, and join their sacrifice so they can have a share in the immortality and in the offerings and all of that, and just be part of the ritual society. And that's what happens at the conclusion of the Aesir-Vanir War. So when you understand that, and it's specifically between this horse twin type as the main kind of hero, aided by the Soma type, and they are battling specifically like the king of the gods, the sovereign of the gods. And so once you understand that framework, I would argue that the only thing that really directly matches this in the Gaelic material is the taking of the She story. So it is when Angus takes the She mound. This is this sacred, it's a fortress. It is a burial mound fortress. And there are different variant versions of this story. In one of the versions, the Dagda is the owner of this mound, of this fortress. And in others, it seems to be Elkvar. So Elkvar is aka Nuada. Nuada is like Varuna, the sovereign type of the gods as well. And so I think, there's variability about who they put as the sovereign of the gods, but the core of the myth remains the same, where Angus, after realizing his true birth was from the high, the Dagda, who's kind of one of the higher sovereign related gods, he goes and he wants to take his birthright, essentially take his place among the gods, among the higher gods. He wants to join where he feels he belongs, even though he's been kind of his whole life he's been put outside. He was sent off to be raised by Mither. He is now trying to rejoin the center among the gods, and so to do that, he has to take back the She mound from, for example, Elkvar, the sovereign of the gods specifically. And to do so, he uses specifically magic spells that compel Elkvar to have to leave the mound. And there's an element of trickery to that, but he uses a couple different actually magical spells that compel him to leave. For example, in the Fosterage of the House of the Two Pales, he uses one as sort of like a specific like magical spell that makes everyone leave the mound, and then he uses a second verbal trick saying that because you allowed me to stay in the mound for like a day and a night, as I asked. Well, really, a day and a night means everything is composed of days and nights, and so that means for all time. So he does this sort of like verbal trick and gets away with it, where that kind of seals the deal magically that he has overtaken the mound. In the Aesir-Vanir War, I think it's implied that magic is being used to compel as well, for especially on the side of the Vanir, to win the war. It's the same with Shavana and the Ashvins. Shavana uses magic to make Indra submit and win the Ashvins a place in the sacrifice and in the society of the high gods. Okay, so once you draw that line, you have the Aesir-Vanir War parallel in place. You can then kind of identify that same framework in the story of Pryderi, I think. From Pryderi, you can then see that he has a more complex set of things that can kind of parallel the Aesir-Vanir War event, because this is where we get into the question of how this maps onto the cycle that I think you wanted to go into, Arno, right? So the concept that I was working with and trying to understand in the book is that this event of when the Ashvins join the Society of the High Gods, when Freyr defeats and joins the Aesir, and when Angus overtakes Elkvar on the mound and overtakes the mound, is that like one of these transition moments that they are so strongly associated, like the night transitioning to morning, or the morning transitioning to night, or is it like the peak of noon? Like, these myths a lot of times were actually seen as connected to one of these sort of times in the cycle, as embodying one of these archetypal moments. So I think that it was possible to see one or the other, that this could have been like a transition to the house of night or a transition to the house of day. But with Pryderi, there's a couple different events, and this can make things confusing. It can also clarify potentially, because upon Pryderi's birth, he is sent to be fostered, or rather, he is taken away by a monster, okay, from his mother, and carried away to the house of Ternan, and Ternan means like the Lord of the Raging Sea or something like that. Okay, I don't have the exact translation in front of me, but Ternan, yeah, his surname Hliant means like of the sea or something. So, and I think Ternan is like a word for Lord. In any case, yeah, he's taken to the Lord of the Raging Sea's house. The scholar Guillaume Udaye, he has argued that this could be the equivalent of like Elkvar Nueva, so that he could be Varunian, the Lord of the waters. That makes a lot of sense. If so, then Varuna is the Lord of the night as well. Is it possible that this is occurring in sort of a transition to nighttime, so that he's being fostered in the realm of the night / the cosmic ocean before he emerges in the morning as the connected to the morning star? You know what I mean? You see this picture that kind of can develop. Okay, so then when he does emerge, when Pryderi does emerge, rather, in or when his story continues, he ultimately begins a battle with Math and Gwydion. And Math and Gwydion are the lords of the sunrise, as I go into. Math is the Savitar type, the lord of the sunrise itself, and Gwydion is Pushan, the lord of the glowing, nourishing power of the sun as it kind of goes out into the world. And they are on a side together, and they are fighting against Pryderi, who has previously, he's had the swine of the underworld that were kind of tricked out of him, and so now he gets in a battle with these lords of the sunrise, and at the conclusion of that battle, Pryderi loses, and there's a hostage-taking scene that reminds somewhat of the hostage-trading scene of the conclusion of the Aesir-Vanir War. Okay, so that all kind of swirls around and becomes interesting, because that whole battle was centered around the swine of the underworld, very much like a symbol of the fertility coming from the chthonic depths, right? Okay, the swine of the underworld. I think it reminds a bit of well, it's I compared how Dumasil says that the Sabine women were like the focus of the Roman version of this Aesir-Vanir War, because there's this kind of like, one of the things that is involved is this a symbol of the fertility, the third function fertility, which is the women there and having children. That could be like symbolically equivalent to the swine that are being fought over in the other one. Some things are sort of offset and displaced and different between those, so that's an open question. But regardless, you have enough pieces there, I think, where it seems like some elements associated with the Aesir-Vanir War type of myth are appearing in the Pryderi hostage-taking story, where he fights a war against the high gods. His war against the high gods are against Math and Gwydion, who are much more like the gods of the sunrise. And he actually loses that battle, though. And then there are hostages, and he's killed. Okay, so in some ways it's like flipped. So, okay, with all of that, Arno, you wanted to go into how this could map, and some thoughts that maybe you had, or questions to discuss or clarify on that. So what would you like to discuss on that?
Yeah, so like Pryderi's birth, and like he's fostered by Tiernan, another name for Neith Nuitha, the god of the nocturnal celestial waters, and then ends up at the end of his life killed by the gods of the morning. And then you went. I don't know. We haven't like talked about this, but we messaged about it a little bit a long time ago about this other figure named Gwer that was one of the three hostages and is mentioned in Kulloch and Olwen, which is, in my opinion, very much mythically timed at the end of the day, based on. So this whole Kulloch and Olwen thing is a Welsh parallel to, Cian and Ethnu at Balor's castle, but also Odin stealing the mead from Sutun's castle. And in this one, unlike the Gaelic version, you have a very blatant parallel to Baugi, who helps Odin break into Sutungr's fortress, in Custennin, who is the brother of Isbethaden, the parallel to Balor or Sutungur. And he asks for Arthur and his men's help because Custennin's been very cruel and has killed 23 out of 24 of his sons. And Sir Kai, the Thunderer, pledges his life to protect the 24th. As especially with Arthur being a Shay, the late arriving diurnal sovereign god, just very much to me called out to like 24 hours of the day. This is like the 24th hour, the end of the day, which in ancient Celtic and Germanic understanding was sunset. And I think you would probably have a better memory on Gwer because I haven't been able to find stuff about him, but I thought I was, seeing how you have this horse twin Gwer, who his story culminates in, the ending of the day half, and then Pryderi, or I think you said it was like another name for Pryderi. And then Pryderi is born and raised by night, and then dies during sunrise to the sunrise gods. It seemed like it came full circle with the Welsh material that's there, and I think it, that's probably the case everywhere. I think Odysseus crossing the sea to the Trojan War and then crossing the sea again to return home is that full circle as well. It's less obvious in the Germanic stuff with Freyr, but I haven't looked at Frothi or the Haddingar to see if there's any evidence of this full daily cycle going on there. It's not so much that the horse twins are the sun themselves, but they're like companions of the sun or their sister, the dawn. But yeah, it was essentially when you told me about Gwer of the golden hair, I believe.
Yeah. I do see Gwer, and I was unable to find exactly where we discussed this, but the Oxford reference is always helpful, because I have looked into these other names, kind of that could be a survival of a twin of Pryderi, right, or a byname or whatever it might be. There are possibilities such as Gwer. So the Oxford reference says, let me wait one second here. Let me just make sure this is working. Mysterious prisoner of Caer Sidi, another name for the otherworldly Annuin in the pre-Norman poem Predu Annuin, the spoils of Annuin, and the Welsh triads cite him as one of the three exalted prisoners of the Isle of Britain, along with Mabon. Goroyu is said to have released him. Some commentators have suggested that Gwyr is a title rather than a name, and may refer to any of several characters in the Mabinogi, including Mabon. So scholars themselves have said that Gwyr could possibly be a title referring back to Mabon. So it's one of those kind of, I haven't gone further onto that because it's one of those kind of hanging, unclear things, but there's potential there. I
did find your message about it. I can read it.
Good. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So Pryderi's alternate name in the Mabinogi is Gwer Washt Iron, however you I'm mispronouncing that. Mabon and Guer, or Guire, are listed together as two of the three exalted prisoners of Britain in the Triads. According to Griffith, this Guer is said to be identified with another mythic figure from the bardic literatures of Wales, Gwir ep Gairoedd, another one of the exalted prisoners listed in 52nd Triad alongside Mabon and Fear. It
Mhm.
remains a strong possibility that Guer represents, as Griffith suggests, a local byname for the divine Maponus, with an emphasis on his role as the magical prisoner. Then in Colwick and Olwen, we indeed find Guer paired with Mabon on an expedition with Arthur, which seems to confirm that Guer is this Gori and that Guer and Mabon are an established pair.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's
That's good.
essentially
That's good. Yeah, that was a while back, so I remember kind of like searching through that and putting that together. But then I guess I kind of like forgot the exact details about it. So thanks for bringing that back up. So yeah, that's definitely something to think about. I think, I mean, just hearing that again, it does seem compelling, especially when you see them paired together in the story. So that's kind of like this feels like a clincher moment that they're paired together, kind of like we always see the horse twins.
Yeah, you
being
have
paired
the
together.
horse twins accompanying the late arriving solar god in a tale where you have mythic symbolism of the end of the day, sunset, and then Praderi, who is born and reared at night and killed in the morning. So that's what, like with the Welsh stuff, that's what I was seeing, this whole daily cycle happening, and I believe that would have been an original trait of the entire horse twin myth that I don't think has survived everywhere. Oh yeah, this guy in the comments is talking about an Ossetian version where
Right.
the
Mhm.
parallel to Skirnir are above. No, he says Diarmuid, but is the other horse twin.
Mhm.
I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say, because like what you just mentioned, you said Bove. So like to me, we see that Bove Jerrig seems to be in the most comparable role to Skirnir in the Gaelic story, where Bove Jerrig goes to help in that role for Angus in the Dream of Angus. Okay, so that seems, it's debatable, but it seems more clear that he's that. And Bov Jerrig has no other indication that he is actually a horse twin. So it's entirely possible that there's a different god type who was like this helper who would come in here. But there's other possibilities. We don't know that for sure. It's possible that Skirnir could be the horse twin. There's just really not enough evidence, I think, to support that, because the parallel doesn't give us any more suggestion that that role was really the horse twin type. But it is an interesting idea to play with. Okay, I did want to say, yeah, this is a good point. That in the evidence I just brought up from Hartmut Scharf, he was arguing that the original Avestan horse twin was singular, and that points to an archaic singular one, whatever. I didn't want to misrepresent that as that's the entire. I shouldn't misrepresent that as that being like the entire Ironic sphere's vision of things. That was just the Avestan. That was solely the Avestan, which is Zoroastrian influenced, one specific text from one specific area, and also it's just one scholar's argument about interpreting that. So yeah, this is very true. That I don't want to say that it's the Ironic understanding as a whole that they had a singular. That may not be true. And
there's a difference between pre-Zoroastrian, Iranian, and post-Zoroastrian.
Yeah, so this is good clarification, and he makes some good points there. So yeah, it's appreciated. But yeah, as far as the what we were talking about with Guire and the cycle and stuff, what does that suggest? Does that suggest anything further to you about how the cycle was working?
Well, I think that would all tie back to what we were going over in the beginning about the astronomical associations with these deities potentially being like the morning and evening stars. It makes sense that Mither or Njorther or Giovanna is like the foster father or father of this god as a lunar deity, since they're gods of like the transition from the house of night to day and vice versa. It makes sense that their father or foster father is a lunar god, in my opinion. Um, they're essentially just that it could be like the evening and dawn stars.
Mhm.
But that always seems to be a bit. I mean, there's. Sorry, that was pretty much it.
Okay, no problem. Just yeah, it is one of these things where I go through. I made an extensive effort to try to map this to how this would have been understood. Is the Iser-Venner War kind of motif as a whole? Is this all about the transition from night to day or day to night? And it still is hard to pin down. So this is one of these issues that is going to have to be kind of worked out or debated a bit, because it seems like we could argue, when Pryderi is born and he goes to the house of Ternan, that is kind of it's becoming nighttime. This is potentially true, supported, because the taking of the she is actually said to be one of the events that happens on Samhain. Okay, so Samhain is around November 1st and is the Halloween moment, and that is seen as the conclusion of the year, and the new year beginning. So that is like the sunset, essentially. That is sun going down. It is now nighttime, winter. The darkness of the cosmic year is beginning, which is December happening. That's like the dead of night, okay, or at least leading into night. And that would make so okay. So if we assume that the taking of the she, that's like really directly the Aesir-Vanir War, okay. Because Elkvar Varuna, he maps very well to Odin, I think, as at least one aspect of that. Okay, and the whole mythos around Angus maps very well to Freyr and how that occurs. He so that we could picture as happening on Samhain. We could then say, Pryderi actually going to the house of Varuna. This has been shifted to where it's just this is happening at the same moment as like the Samhain transition into night. It's not being given the battle scene at that moment. Okay, I think a shift has happened here, where the battle in the Welsh version has shifted to the morning transition, but they mirror each other. The transition to night and the transition to morning mirror each other, so motifs can be exchanged back and forth between these mythical moments, right? But it doesn't make sense. It doesn't really make sense to map it the other way. If you see what I'm saying, when Pryderi then goes to fight the lords of the sunrise, Math and Gwydion, that's clearly like the moment of sunrise, because that is when Math rises from his seat with his feet in the lap of the Virgin, who is the representation of night. He's rising from night. It is the sunrise. That's when he fights Pryderi. So that seems very much like the morning. But Math and the morning sovereign doesn't really map to Odin per se, in a direct. Math is much more like what did I say? Dellinger. Math is like Dellinger. So okay. So if you see what I'm saying, it seems like Pryderi going to the house of Ternan really maps to the taking of the she and the Aesir-Vanir War, but some of the war motifs in the Welsh version have been transferred instead to the morning transition, where he fights the Lords of Sunrise, and then the hostage situation happens, and that hostage situation is paralleled in the Aesir-Vanir War outcome. Okay, but in that conclusion, Pryderi actually dies instead of becoming one of the members of the society. So you can see there's a misfit there, where the battle of Pryderi against Math, it doesn't exactly match what we would expect from the Aesir Vanir War because of those reasons. Because that's when he like dies after when the sunrise happens, he essentially dies, or subsequent to the sunrise. Really, after that battle, he has a battle. He's taken hostage, and then he gets in a fight with Gwydion and dies. But in any case, it seems to me like, yeah, because the sunset and the sunrise are mirror images of each other, and they're connected, just like the morning star and the evening star are continuous or reflect one another.
I think they're both Venus.
They're both Venus in some
So
in some traditions, at least. Yeah, exactly. So it's really just one star, at least theoretically. In principle, it can be one star, and so yeah, if you understand what I'm saying, we have this Aesir Vanir War motif. You can put it up on a pedestal and try to compare it across the board, but the main Aesir Vanir War motifs, they compare to the taking of the Sidhe in the Gaelic, and the moment of transition compares to when Pryderi is stolen away by the monster and taken to the house of Ternan, I think, and fostered during the night. Okay, so some things have shifted there, but he ends up in the same place, essentially. Elkvar is equivalent to Ternan, right? So he's gone to the same place, and then this explains why when Pryderi fights Math, it has elements of the Aesir Vanir War that we want to compare, and we would compare, and that's accurate because it's this continuous mythos. But in the Welsh version, it's been focused. Those myth themes have been focused on the morning transition, I think, and then the death of Pryderi following. And I think it's at least possible that the death of Pryderi. Well, this is another complicated question because the Mabon is famously a prisoner in the underworld. He's like imprisoned. So is the prisonership in the underworld, is that comparable to when Pryderi dies? Or is that comparable to when Pryderi is taken to Ternan's house in the night? Is that comparable to when Rhiannon is kidnapped and then Pryderi is there with her at that time and then has to, like, you know what I mean? Like Pryderi goes there as well. Okay, so is that when the Mabon is? Okay, it's an interesting. There's a lot of interesting questions to this. Like Pryderi is associated with these events that could map to being trapped in the underworld. Like the death of a god can trap you in the underworld. We then have Angus, right? We know that Angus takes the Sidhe, and this maps to Samhain, so perhaps the transition to night. But then we also have the story in Scottish folklore of Angus. Trying to. It is said that he tries to kind of aspire to being king of the universe, king of the gods, and that he is cast down and defeated and imprisoned in a rock. Okay, so it's the same. There are these themes that are shifted around. Like Angus is this god who we know in his mythos, he's the lower type of god who wants to aspire to join the gods. But there's also this myth theme where he like dies and or is like imprisoned in something, like imprisoned in rock, imprisoned in the underworld. And when those specific events happen in the cycle might be kind of played with and shifted around so that it becomes confusing. So yeah, is there any points on that seem like they could be clarified based on what we're talking about? Because I know this is confusing. Not everything can be one-to-one perfectly aligned, unfortunately. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean that makes sense. It seems so with the Gaelic taking the Sidhe, that seems. I mean, it says that it takes place at Samhain, so that's mapping onto the yearly cycle. Which daily, yearly cycle? I mean, these the same symbols for the different points of the day or the year can map onto one another. It's like interchangeable. The reason I said daily cycle for the Welsh stuff was because of the 24-hour potential symbolism that I might be reading eisegesically into it. But I mean, seems very much like it. And then with his death by Math and Gwydion. But I mean, it seems pretty clear once, like if you've read the stories and you're familiar with what they say. I think it's pretty clear there. The only way people would be confused is if they're just
Yeah.
unfamiliar with the stories in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I wonder if, like, I guess I still wonder about exactly where the prisonership of the Mabon. The Mabon is this famous prisoner, and the Mabon, it's the directly linguistic equivalent of, the Mac Ok or Mac Indok, who is Angus. Okay, so the Mabon we know is equivalent to Angus, and then it seems like Pryderi is sort of paralleled or does similar things with the Mabon, and so those have been equated. And there's this kind of there's a tradition in scholarship of equating Pryderi potentially with the Mabon. Okay, and the whole the Mabinogion, well, the four branches of the Mabinogi. There's been debate, of course, about what this exactly means. Does it mean that these are stories about the Mabon? Does it mean they are stories for young boys? There's different discussion about that among scholars. But if there's at least a play on words with the Mabon in the Mabinogi, it's interesting that Pryderi is the only figure who appears in all four branches, the only main sort of hero who appears in all four branches. Even though he dies, of course, early on in the fourth branch, and then it becomes a story of Hle instead. He's the connecting thread throughout all of them. Pryderi is, and this is the four branches of the Mabinogi. So that's interesting, and then there are, of course, Pryderi dies after fighting the high gods of the sun of the morning, and Angus Og gets trapped in stone after trying to take over the throne of the gods, essentially. Okay, so like, is Angus's aspiring to lordship of the universe, is that comparable to when Pryderi dies, perhaps? Because it seems that well, I'm not sure, because in other Scottish tales, Angus just marries Brydia and becomes the king of summer, essentially. And so that sounds like he successfully lives on throughout summer. But there can be variant traditions even within Scotland that emphasize different things. So you never can fully pin that down, I think. But I wish there was more things I could sort of bring clarity to on that, or help to put together. But it's sort of a continuous project to nail these things down. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can continue very far there. I could go over just a couple little small things.
Yeah, go for it.
That I wanted to mention throughout, and then probably
we'll see. Yeah, then I have to head out. I have to head out in the next, like 5 minutes. So hopefully we can touch on this.
There is a Rigvedic hymn to the Rebus where they're described as, so they have a smithing competition. Rebus are a class of divine craftsmen. They have a smithing competition with Tvashtar, the Allmaker, where among the many things they craft for the Devas, they fashion the Ashvin's light car that also can ride in the water. And they are also said in Rigveda 451:6 to have finished their works by dawn, which might, I bring that up since the dawn goddess and the horse twins are almost always siblings and or lovers. They're very closely related. That could have to do with Freya commissioning the Brisingamen by the dwarves. So you still have this, just like what Joseph was talking about with the Dioscuric hymns, talking about them being shipmen and horsemen. Maybe because ships are seen as like the horses of the sea. Poseidon is a god of horses and the sea. That was pretty much what I just liked that little detail of the Rebus also crafting the car. But there is a potential Greek version that's so similar but also so different from Culhwch and Olwen, where because I think Jason and Medea are a lot like Pwyll and Rhiannon or Criniac and Macha. And I was trying to compare the whole episode of Jason Medea with those two, and it led me to um, label the golden fleece, or like the ram that the golden fleece came from. The ram is a son of Poseidon, as what's in the position of Pryderi, and that draken that's guarding it being like the monster that takes him. Beyond that, I can't say anything about what it means because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It
Right.
seems like the framework is there, but everything else
Hmm.
is quite different, like the whole meaning of the myth and all that.
It's an interesting possibility. I haven't looked at the Golden Fleece nearly closely enough to. It's so sprawling and yeah, I haven't looked at it enough.
Yeah, and then I think you also said in like the first like Rig Vedic hymn you read that they give out peace too. That's like one of the
Mhm.
things that they
Yeah.
deal out or are prayed to for. Usually when Freyr and Njord are prayed to together, Njord is bid for wealth and Freyr for peace. That's like what he's most famously worshipped for. Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah,
That's a thing that comes up with the third function, especially, and with this horse twin type. So it is pertinent, definitely. Well, the last thing I just wanted to touch on is to give the citation for where Peridurus appears with a sort of twin-like brother. There is a sequence here in Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain 3:13. Okay, and they are described as his twain other brothers who shared the kingdom in twain. Okay, are they twins? They're twain. They're twains. Okay, they are the horse twains, and so the seemingly close unity of these two youngest brothers. They're again the youngest brothers. It's exactly the same as Nakula and Sahadeva, the horse twin incarnations. Among the Pandavas, they're the two youngest brothers. And they're sharing this in twain. Okay, and their names are Peridurus and Ingenious, right? And we know that Peridurus is a Latinized form of Peridur, and it has been argued extensively by scholars that Peridur is Pryderi because their myths, their stories are very close to the same or comparable. Okay, there's connecting lines between Pryderi and Peredur. Okay, which I go into. I can't go into it all right now, unfortunately. That gives an idea. This is sort of the sequence that occurs in that pseudo history, and it sort of is reminiscent of the Aesir Vanir war motifs because the twin-like brothers even team up against their older brother and imprison him in a tower. Okay, in this sort of reminiscent of this structure that we've been analyzing. And then we have this was interesting because we must at the same time wonder at the name of the brother of Peridurus, that is Ingenious. And Ingenious is the name that in different manuscripts it appears as Owainus, and that's Owen. Okay, so Ingenious and Owainus are alternate names of the same figure that I go into all these manuscripts. But Ingenious is so mysteriously reminiscent of Freyr's name, Ing or Ingvi, right? Reminiscent also of even the name Angus and even Hengist. That's probably more of a coincidence, but phonetic coincidences are interesting in this question. But we then have, Angus and we have Ingenious. Is this a continuous name, a name that is being reused in different ways that could connect to the name Ing? Is it possible? That's something I raise in here. And I think that's something that you think is plausible as well, that the name Ing could come from the same root as Angus and Ingenious, at least possibly. Okay, what do you think about it?
yeah, I definitely I can't. I don't know about the
Yeah.
historicity of like the stages of the language and where it would have happened. We do have a lot of Celtic loanwords into Germanic languages, not vice versa. There's a lot of Celtic into Germanic and then Germanic into Finnish. Seems to be the flow of the loanwords there.
Yeah.
I do think like I'm convinced that Ing comes from Angus. I don't see how it can't because it doesn't have a Germanic etymology, does it?
And let's just remind people that the Germanic the Proto-Germanic should be Ingus like this, right? Do you think
Yeah.
that's true? Do you think that's actually
I
true?
think that's true. A lot of like when people do like rune divination, they call it ingwaz.
Right, Inguas, but
But I
well,
do,
anyways,
yeah,
online it says it should be Ingus somewhere where I cited this.
yeah. Which I mean, when you compare it to the old Irish spelling of oingus, which is O-I with the accent,
Yeah.
I-N-G-U-S, it's so close.
Right.
There
I go into
is
some
also that other
possibilities,
theory
and
where it could be, yeah,
Ancus is, anyways, I go into some of these.
Yeah.
Go into some of these possible theories. This is not like definitive. Some of this is quite speculative, but fascinating. I think it's too fascinating
Yeah.
to not kind of try to trace this out, which is what I go through in my book. So, anyways, if people are interested in that, I really tried to dig into this and give as many sort of leads as possible in that passage to show that Angus and Angus, there's this other name, Ingenious, which becomes Oanus also. And these names seem to, there's a consistency to how they keep appearing connected to these figures in this shared mythos with these same sort of myth themes as well. So there's something there to be looked at. And I've got to run now. I'm running late to be done with this. I've got to go do some real life things, but thank you for being here with me, Arno. I appreciate you and taking the time, and Josephus as well, who had to run. Thank you, Josephus, for being here, and thank you to everyone for listening. This is a lot of fun, a lot of just incredibly dense, deep rabbit holes to continue going into. But please check out my book chapter on this. I'd really like people to kind of see what they think of that. And yeah, thanks, Arno.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, have a good one, everyone.
All right.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.